let me introduce the panelists to you. Gonzalo Hernández Licona, he is the go-to scholar, the go-to man in Mexico and in Latin America for assessing social programs. Gonzalo was the head of the Mexican agency in charge of assessing social programs, Coneval, for over a decade. So he's well known in the world. He's a world-class economist, mostly dedicated to assess social programs. And I want to thank as well Carlos Magis for joining us. He is a professor at the School of Medicine in the National University of Mexico. Thank you, Carlos, for being with us. He has a deep knowledge on Mexican public health, and I appreciate him joining us today. And we will have Beth Sheridan. She is the Washington Post correspondent in Mexico City. This is her second tour of Beth in Mexico, and she's been covering Mexico for the last 25 years. I mean, she's a senior, she's such a mature journalist, and I will say that Beth was with us last year. At this time, we organized this AMLO at 1, and she was part of the cast. Of course, we were meeting here in San Diego, and on a beautiful day as it is today, and unfortunately, we have to do this virtually. While Beth, and then we will have Luis Carlos Ugalde. Luis Carlos Ugalde is a well-known Mexican political scientist. He has a PhD from Columbia University, and Luis Carlos was the head of the National Electoral Institute, and now he heads Integralia, one of the, I would say, very powerful consulting firm in Mexico. They just put it together, this wonderful AMLO 2 assessment, and of course, once Luis Carlos joins us, he will tell us about it. So let me, having all of you here, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I will ask Gonzalo Hernández to start with his presentation. So Gonzalo, why don't you give us an assessment of how, I mean, what has been the impact of Andrés Manuel López Obrador social programs, how you see poverty in Mexico evolving during the last 2 years. We know that one of the most important pledges of President López Obrador was los pobres primero, first. We're going to work for the poor Mexicans. So could you give us a sense of how things are during the last 2 years? And thank you, Gonzalo, for accepting our invitation.
No, thank you very much, Rafael. It's a pleasure always to be with you and with this very important set of friends and colleagues who really are experts on their fields. So let me start by saying, let me just talk about something a bit on the past. So let me just remind all of us what was Mexico like before AMLO, before López Obrador. So the country was not growing very much. It was only growing on average 1.2% every year per capita, which is not that much. It's actually very poor. Household income was stagnated for a long time. Between 1992 and 2018, average household income was always the same in both ends. Poverty was 42%. We had a huge inequality. I'll give you an example. Extreme poverty for urban non-indigenous men was 4% in 2018. And extreme poverty for indigenous women in rural areas was 45%. So in every sense, in every cut, in every variable, you find there is inequality, or there was inequality. It was a slow growth for many and great growth for a few, as someone said for me. It was corruption for a long time. So, and Mexico had voted for the PRI, then for the PAN, then for the PRI again, with some achievements, but not that many. So we had the same problems. And AMLO was a person with a very good narrative. He is still a person with a very good narrative. And of course, he took advantage of the pre-RI PAN mistakes. And of course, the table was set for AMLO to be the president. There were a couple of elements that were okay before, and let me just address three of them. So, I mean, we had these problems, but we had some achievements in the past. One is that it was a real increase in basic services coverage, like in water, electricity, schooling, housing, access to health services. And the main reason why that happened, so while poverty was up, extreme poverty was going down in the past, in the recent past. And the main element was that there were some programs that were relatively good targeted towards the extreme poverty population. So Prospera, Seguro Popular, Estancias Infantiles, there were some programs that were really good in targeting, and therefore the reduction of deprivations in terms of access to water, access to electricity, access to schooling. So it was all right. And of course, for public policy, especially for social policy, there have been advances in evaluation and transparency. We were able to say this because we had the data and the information and the evaluations to know that. And then we have the present government. I'll start with some, I think, good elements, and then I'll go to some problems from my point of view. One is AMLO increased in a good way the minimum wage. I mean, the minimum wage has been really low in Mexico for a long time, but AMLO started to increasing it in the past 2 years, and that element was perhaps the most responsible, or the cause of increasing in labor income in the past years, including this year at the beginning. And his view of public policy, of social policy, is about giving cash transfers for vulnerable groups, young people, senior citizens, people with disabilities, working mothers. So these are, I think, the two main features, which I think they are good, especially the first one. However, what are the problems that I see, Rafael and friends? One is, of course, we don't have enough resources for all programs. So AMLO started getting rid of important programs: Prospera, Seguro Popular, Empleo Temporal, nurseries, full-time schools. So they got rid of programs, and most of them, they were doing really well in terms of increasing coverage for people and in terms of targeting. In fact, the budget for social programs in 2020 is lower than in 2014. So you got rid of some programs, you include some others, but in overall, the budget is lower. Targeting now is not that clear because Prospera was the most important program for targeting to the poor population. It was not perfect, but it was the best we had. Now we don't have it. And I believe, and if I have time, I'll show you some figures, that targeting today is worse than it was a couple of years ago. So it is not that clear that the resources are going to the poorest in Mexico. We hadn't had a change in budget of priorities due to COVID. In 2020 and 2021, we still have the same ideas, the same objectives, the same programs, as if COVID never happened. And I believe that with the problems we have, we really need to change priorities. For instance, we don't have programs to support employment, to support small firms. And another element that I have to tell is that I believe that this government they don't have a lot of trust in private firms, which is a problem, because if we want a recovery, we really need to rely and trust in private investment. And after that, or in the middle of this, we have the following results, Rafa. There was a reduction of labor income of 12.5% between the first quarter and the third quarter of 2020. And the main reason was that in the middle of the pandemic, we have a reduction of 12 million people on job lost. 12 million people lost their jobs. We've been recovering slowly, but it's a reduction of 12.5% in labor income, which meant an increase of 25% in labor poverty in this same period. 11.2 million people increased poverty over the past months. Inequality has been increased because those who were lost jobs and income, it was more people without proper schooling and women. Therefore, inequality has been increased, poverty has been increased. And finally, I don't think this government is taking evaluation and transparency very, very seriously. And if you don't evaluate, if you don't see good data, then it's very difficult to improve what we do. So I'll leave it like that, Rafa, and then we come back later, perhaps.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. This is a wonderful tour of horizon of what's happening in the poverty programs. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I want to let you know that there's a Q&A bottom down there. So please send your questions. Our panelists, they will respond to your questions, and I will, of course, ask them your questions. So please, let's try to make this as dynamic as possible. This is your webinar, and just send us your questions. I'll come back to you, Gonzalo, because I guess a very important question is, how much, poverty is increasing in Mexico, but how much this is due to the COVID-19, and how much this is due because Andrés Manuel López Obrador has decided to only target a few programs, his favorite programs. But let me go to Beth Sheridan. Beth, I already introduced you as a wonderful investigative journalist. Lately, you've been writing this series for your paper, The Washington Post, on Mexican violence. Actually, welcome, Luis Carlos Ugalde, and I'm sorry for the technical problems, but we all are here, so this is a wonderful program with Luis Carlos Ugalde, Gonzalo, Hernández, Licona, Carlos Magis, and Beth Sheridan. And again, please send those your questions. And there's translation, there's interpretation, simultaneous interpretation. Go to the bottom if you want to listen to this in Spanish. Beth, you were here last year in Santiago, in AMLO at 1, and I hope you're going to be with us the next 4 years. So you ended up writing a beautiful 6-essay, a small book about AMLO birthdays. What is your take this year, Beth?
So I have been, as you say, focusing quite a bit on security matters, and it's, this is an area where clearly there just has not been very much progress. If you look at the numbers, we have figures now on homicides for the first 23 months of this government. We don't have November yet, I don't think, but at any rate, for the first 23 months of this government, homicides are up 12% over the previous 23 months. So clearly the homicides are the metric that everyone focuses on because it's such a dramatic sign of violence in Mexico. Now, the president makes the point that the dramatic rise in homicides has sort of slowed, right? We've bent the curve, but the point is they're still rising. And he also makes the point often that many other crimes have gone down, things like kidnapping, robbery on public transport, robbery of cars, things like that. Now, there's been some progress for sure. It seems like, for example, with car robberies, that has gone down. But I think a lot of crime analysts think that some of the decline is due to the fact that, people were home during the large parts of the pandemic. They weren't going on public transport. So those crimes, of course, declined. Home robberies declined because people were home. I also think there's some questions about reporting. If you look at the number of forced or disappearances, that number's down fairly well. It was a record last year. It was 8,800 or so reported. This year, I believe it's more like 6,000. But again, I think with judicial offices not always working at full capacity, there's a question about reporting, right? Did people have the ability to go report? And some of those are lagging. I think when we look at the strategy of President López Obrador, one of the main ideas he had was the famous abrazos no balazos, hugs not bullets, to use social programs to go to what he sees as the root of a lot of the violence and criminal activity. So it's really poverty, young people without job opportunities. And there has been quite a outpouring of spending on social programs, as Gonzalo mentioned. But one thing that to me is not clear is how much there's any structure for trying to ensure that two things work together. In other words, say young people get jobs and are oriented away from crime. In other words, I don't see a real connection in how those two goals are working together. And of course, with all the job losses, with the pandemic and the economic crisis, it's hard to see real progress there. The second element that's really central to his security policies is the Guardia Nacional. And they have stood up the Guardia Nacional, the National Guard, very quickly, really. I mean, bear in mind, they had a constitutional amendment. They assembled this whole force, and there's probably something like 90,000, maybe 100,000 National Guard now. However, the government's goal was to replace a civilian police with a National Guard with civilian character. It would be much bigger, like 3 times the size, and it really would be about kind of territorial control, taking back parts of the territory where crime groups have come to dominate. And one thing that is so they've managed to stand up a National Guard for sure, very quickly. However, the idea of it having a civilian character hasn't really materialized. It's about 80% former or military police or naval police who have been transferred over. And I think there's a lot of questions, because if the idea is to really build up effective civilian institutions that can, the justice system, the police, that can, solve crime and discourage crime, using the military, of course, the government would argue it's all we had, but it creates a lot of problems in terms of, human rights abuses, in terms of not going to the real crux of the problem, which is a good system of police and investigators who can solve crimes and then discourage them. And then finally, I guess I would add, I think there's a lot of concern because the president traditionally had been critical of relying on the military, but in fact, he's relying on them really much more than just about, any of his predecessors for decades. And that is true both in the number. If you look at the number of soldiers deployed in the Army, it's up by about 20%. Those are doing security related tasks. In the Marines, it's up even more, it's almost double. Now, some of that is COVID response, whether it's doctors, whether it's building hospitals, protecting medical shipments. However, you do see certainly a very significant presence of the military in all sorts of security related tasks. And then the president has increasingly turned to the military for things like, building the new airport outside Mexico City, building this whole network of kind of ATM branches for his social programs to get the money to people, running the ports. It's now in the hands of the military. So I think there's a real question about not only, you can question whether the military ultimately can effectively really transform the security, create a decline in violence. But then you have the other problem of, are your civilian institutions becoming somewhat weaker? Powers are being turned over to a military that traditionally has not been very transparent or accountable. So we're really in a situation of not seeing much progress on the security front.
Thank you, Maribeth. And we will come back to you and ask you a few questions about U.S. Mexican relations, about this, how you see the relationship between AMLO and Biden evolving in the next 4 years. But let me go to Luis Carlos Ugalde. Luis Carlos, I was already I already introduced you, and something that I didn't say is that you were part of a summer seminar of our center, and since then you've been attached, and you love to come to San Diego, and we love to have you here and to host you here, and we hope you could stay here a longer time so you could write a book or an article. And but anyhow, I was telling everybody that Integralia just put together this wonderful assessment of AMLO at 2. Could you give us a sense, I mean, how you see generally, I mean, in general terms, AMLO's performance, and how come he continues to have a fairly robust, I mean, most Mexicans in the low 60s, they believe that he's doing a good job. So how this is, I mean, what this could be, how can this could be explained, Carlos? And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Rafael. And as you say, I have been attached to the center for many years. It was 1989. I remember that well. When I first came to the center for a summer seminar that lasted for 2 decades, I think, and that is a gorgeous place, but most of all, it is a very relevant place to analyze Mexican politics and U.S. Mexico relations. Thank you very much, Rafael, and I promise I will be there soon. How do we see at Integralia a balance between achievements and omissions or deficiencies or mistakes? And I want to be clear, I want to be balanced, because in Mexico today, most analysts and most political actors are radicalized either to one side, saying that AMLO is the worst demon on the landscape, or the followers of AMLO who says that he is doing everything fine. So I will try to be balanced in my perspective. And I have to begin by saying that the main achievements are some. For example, and I would say this is the most relevant, which is he has brought hope to Mexican politics again. And this is very relevant. For many decades, Mexicans were losing confidence in the political system as a whole, losing confidence in institutions. And this is the first time for a long time in which a man brings hope that politics can be a means to change reality. So it is not only that his popularity is very high, I will talk about that later, but he has brought trust to the federal government, which passed from 25% in 2017 to 52% last year. So this was a double increase in the confidence in the federal government. The armed forces passed from 62 to 73%. These are figures from the National Institute of Statistics, which are very robust and professional. Even Congress, imagine the Mexican Congress, which has always been at the bottom of the table of trust in institutions. It passed from 20 to 30% of trust. I was the other day with a Mexican governor who told me that his popularity had increased during the first 2 years of this administration. And I asked him why. And he said, well, I have done a great job, but I was thinking later, well, what has he done something very relevant so that his popularity has increased? And I think that many governors have seen their popularity rising because of López Obrador. So when López Obrador goes to a visit in their states, they simply accompany López Obrador, take a picture with him, and that has increased governor's popularity. So López Obrador has done that, and I think this is something important. Of course, we can see the other side of the coin, because if you don't guide this hope into a right direction, then it can be a source of radical populism and destruction. But let me say that at a first sight, this is something positive. Second, Gonzalo already has said this, but he has made the poor the priority of his administration, and the transfers to the elderly, which is the most popular program, passed from 40,000 million pesos in 2018 to 133,000 million pesos. This is very relevant, and this, I would say, is one of the reasons why López Obrador is so popular, because even if you don't have within your family an elder, people see that with a lot of empathy, and this has made López Obrador very well loved by many Mexicans. And so this is a second reason and a second positive sign of López Obrador administration. The third one I would say is the fiscal responsibility. He has kept public accounts in balance. Of course, we can argue as well that that has had negative impacts in other areas, of course, but I would say that keeping public accounts in balance made Standard & Poor's yesterday and Fitch Ratings agency last week to say that they will keep the investment grade of Mexican public finances in that level, at least in the short term. And that has made that this economic crisis, in contrast to that of 1995, for example, this one is not creating so much damage because we have kept the macroeconomic stability in place, and that has helped that the damage is contained somehow. And finally, I would say that another positive sign of López Obrador administration is that he has reduced superfluous government spending, the so-called austeridad. Of course, there is a negative side to this aspect, but let me just mention that, for example, the spending of the Office of the President of Mexico, which reached about 5 billion pesos just in the last year of Peña Nieto, has come to less than 1,000 billion pesos. And this is very relevant because it shows that, of course, you can continue working and performing your duties even if you spend less. Of course, I will not talk about fideicomisos, reducing the spending of very relevant offices, but somehow there was enormous spending in certain areas that were not relevant to the Mexican public. Now, what are the main errors or omissions or mistakes that I see? The first one, the most relevant, I would say, is the lack of managerial skills, the lack of planning, the lack of goals other than popularity to measure how you perform your duties. For example, to begin with, the National Development Plan is not such a plan. There is not a National Development Plan. What López Obrador did was to take the draft of the National Development Bank that was done by the Treasury Department, and he said, this is very technocratic. I don't like this. This has a lot of numbers and a lot of graphs. So he simply changed that, asked his speechwriter to produce a document in 2 days, and that was the National Development Proposal that he sent to Congress, was approved by the Chamber of Deputies, and so there is not a plan. That is just an act of propaganda. The second problem with López Obrador is the use of alternative reality, the disregard for facts, numbers, the lack of veracity in how he talks. One of the means that you can understand his thinking in this area was last week. He was asked what he thought that Bloomberg, the agency, the financial agency, had said that Mexico was at the bottom of 53 countries measured as how they had performed in regard to COVID-19. And he said, who cares about Bloomberg? Who reads Bloomberg reports? So basically what he was saying is that he doesn't care because his public, his followers don't read in English Bloomberg reports, and therefore he doesn't care about that. So this is a problem not only of López Obrador, but every populist leader in the world, including Mr. Trump, of course, disregards facts, veracity, truth as a guide to public policy, and that is a damage he has done. For example, just last Tuesday, López Obrador said that he had fulfilled 97 of the promises he made on his first day in office, 97 of 100. We at Integralia, and I invite you that you can go and download the report, which is in our webpage. We estimate that he has only fulfilled 47 out of 100. So he simply says whatever he wants to say, and his followers will believe whatever he says. Then we see that another mistake of our omission is the lack of a comprehensive strategy to fight corruption. He says every day that there is no more corruption in Mexico nowadays, and that is of course not true. Other than talking and focusing on his public consultation to investigate former presidents, other than that, he's doing very little. There is nothing to reduce bribery in public procurement. There is nothing to strengthen institutional capacities to fight corruption. There is nothing to fight corruption at the state and local levels. He has done something in investigating money laundering and tax evasion, and that is very positive. But there is not a comprehensive prevention strategy to fight corruption, and therefore we believe that systemic corruption will continue to be the same in the following years. And another mistake or omission is that he's destroying the investors' confidence in the Mexican economy. And therefore, the recovery of the Mexican economy will be very slow. He is on the one hand talking with Mexican entrepreneurs, but on the other side, he's attacking the reputation of some companies. He is attacking some sectors of the private energy investments, and therefore, that is another mistake. Finally, I would say that one of the most relevant and that was just said is that there is a lack of results in reducing public insecurity. Basically, the problem continues to be the same. And as it was said just before me, the numbers declined marginally in the past few months, but it was basically because of the confining of Mexicans. My conclusion, all of this contrasts with a simple but real fact that AMLO continues to be very popular. So your question would be, how is this possible? Well, AMLO brings emotional satisfaction to Mexicans. This emotional satisfaction is very relevant because most Mexicans, 60% of them, see every day one man talking against the privilege of the elite, talking about tax evasion by the rich, talking about the corruption of the past. They see López Obrador close to the people, being like one of them. And this emotional satisfaction is what, in my opinion, makes him so popular. I don't see any factor in the short term changing that situation. I would say that probably in the second half of the sexenio, if insecurity continues very high, if cases of corruption continues to emerge, and they will continue emerging, of people close to López Obrador, that will begin to break this image of the man, but not until now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Luis Carlos. This is a wonderful tour de horizon of governance in Mexico. And it's, as you say, very balanced. And I very much, I'm sure that Beth and Gonzalo and Carlos would like to talk to you about this emotional satisfaction that he's providing to Mexicans. And I like the term. And it's, although in 2008, Felipe Calderón had about the same numbers. Those were different times, but usually Mexican presidents, they get good grades, with the exception of Enrique Peña Nieto, especially we compare them, Luis Carlos, to South American or to Latin American leaders. But let's go to healthcare issues. We have Carlos Magis, Gonzalo, Beth, and Luis Carlos. There's quite a few questions, and please send us more questions. Now, Carlos, he asked me, he's going to address us in Spanish, but he will answer questions in English. To all of you who do not speak Spanish, go to the interpretation bottom and choose English, please. So that way you will listen to Carlos in English. Adelante, Carlos, por favor.
Gracias, Rafael. Creo que lo más importante que ha hecho López Obrador en salud, y puedo pasar después a los números, siguiendo, inspirado por lo que acabo de oír, es que es la primera vez que un presidente, y llevo 30 años hasta mayo del año pasado trabajando en la Secretaría de Salud, es la primera vez que un presidente habla de salud constantemente. Es una prioridad para él hablar de salud y lo ha hecho. Antes incluso de la epidemia de COVID, estaba permanentemente hablando de salud. Por supuesto, muy marcado por su descreimiento en el seguro popular, pero está hablando en salud. Incluso lo siguiente, lo realmente fantástico de este presidente es que ofreció algo que todos los que trabajamos en salud pública venimos esperando y luchando por eso desde hace mucho, que es un sistema de salud universal, gratuito y público, como él dijo, que se parezca a lo de los países del norte de Europa. Claro, la meta es muy, muy grande y justo ahora, el 1 de diciembre, acaba de ya entrar en efecto la gratuidad de todos los servicios de los Institutos Nacionales de Salud, de la Secretaría de Salud. Ya eran gratuitos hospitales de segundo nivel y de primero. El problema de esa promesa es que, por lo que veo en los analistas económicos, no está acompañado con el presupuesto para lograrlo. Y además, el problema fue que, como dijeron mis colegas antes, en medio de eso cayó COVID, y COVID realmente está siendo un problema muy, muy, muy intenso. Entonces, México tenía un desempeño bueno en salud. Eso es una de las partes que deploro del discurso oficial, hablar de que todo estaba mal en salud. Claro que no, digamos, la esperanza de vida al nacer en México era de casi 47 años en 1950. Para 2018 llegó a 75 años. Aumentamos 28 años. La tasa de mortalidad infantil, que nos importa muchísimo a los que trabajamos en salud pública, bajó de 132 por cada 1000 a 12.1 por cada 1000 para 2018 en ese mismo periodo. Entonces, México, por supuesto que estaba haciendo, y cada periodo de las personas que trabajamos en el sector salud, hayamos sido de gobiernos priistas o panistas, habíamos hecho un esfuerzo. ¿Qué otro problema tenemos? Pues sí, diabetes viene avanzando desde 1980. Todos los secretarios de salud de los últimos 3 gobiernos han intentado limitar el crecimiento de la diabetes. Una de las ventajas que tenemos ahora es esta modificación de las etiquetas de alimentos. Creo que va a tener impacto. Creo que va a tener impacto porque ya ha tenido impacto en otros países donde se ha impulsado, como Chile. Por otro lado, teníamos un sistema de salud, no estaba tirado en el suelo, era un sistema de salud que tenía, como todo sistema, sus problemas, pero tenía 1,400 hospitales, tiene 23,000 unidades de salud, 90,000 camas sensables, casi 225,000 médicas y médicos, 310,000 enfermeras. En un día típico, nos decía, estoy viendo unos datos que presentó en la Academia Nacional de Medicina el doctor Narro a principios del 2018, cerca de 1.2 millones de atenciones diarias. Entonces, sí era un sistema funcionando, el cual empezó a cambiar, por supuesto, en todo el discurso del 2019. ¿Cuál fue el cambio? El cambio fue que cambió la forma como se compraban los medicamentos. En vez de hacerse en la Secretaría de Salud, las decisiones pasaron a Hacienda. Hacienda pasó a tomar todas las decisiones y no se puede ser experto en todo. Se cometieron, desde mi punto de vista, y además está muy, muy publicado, varios errores en las formas de comprar y se distorsionó el mercado de insumos. Lo vemos muy claramente con las demandas de padres y madres de niños con cáncer. Y en medio de eso, con esos problemas, no compramos a tiempo el año pasado, compramos después de la época de lluvias insecticidas, tuvimos más dengue, la vacuna de sarampión la teníamos, no se decidió usar hasta después. Tuvimos por primera vez desde 1995 casos de sarampión, era una enfermedad que teníamos controlada. Y llegamos al cambio fundamental en la ley, que es la aparición del INSABI. Y el INSABI crea además una crisis dentro del gobierno actuante, porque la subsecretaria de Salud, hasta Cristina Laurel, la secretaria de Salud de López Obrador cuando él fue jefe
Carlos,
de
¿puedes
gobierno.
explicar lo que es el INSABI?
El INSABI es un instituto que se denomina Instituto de Salud para el Bienestar y apareció en el discurso del gobierno ahí a mediados del año de 2019 y ya constituido y sustituyendo a lo que era la estructura administrativa del Seguro Popular y con los recursos que tenía el Seguro Popular, aparece ya legalmente en este año, en febrero de 2020, ya lo tenemos con nosotros. Los analistas hablan de que el INSABI todavía no ha puesto claramente sus reglas de operación, pero lo que sí tiene es el control de los recursos para trabajar. Pero ese mismo proceso de creación del INSABI significó una fractura dentro de la Secretaría de Salud, la salida y con la publicación en periódicos nacionales de su molestia por la doctora Cristina Laurel, la que venía pensando el modelo de salud desde el gobierno de la Ciudad de México y luego durante su primer año como subsecretaria de Innovación y Desarrollo. Ella había puesto un esfuerzo muy fuerte en lo que decimos en salud, que es atención primaria en salud, la que se hace a nivel, digamos, comunitario y en unidades de primer nivel. Y eso fue, en ese caldo es donde aparece COVID, y COVID nos da otra buena noticia, que es este fenómeno de datos abiertos. Es la primera vez que tenemos de cualquier enfermedad algo que cualquier persona puede entrar a internet, bajar la base de datos y empezarla a usar. A partir de esto, bueno, un poco en el terreno de la broma, ya no me cuesta explicar a la gente que soy epidemiólogo y digo qué es lo que hago, porque hay una cantidad de epidemiología hecha en Twitter donde vemos mucha gente analizando los datos. Desde este año, en mi posición en la Facultad de Medicina como profesor, decidimos seguirlo quincenalmente y ahora mensualmente la epidemia de COVID, y lo podemos hacer y publicar un boletín porque tenemos los datos abiertos. Los datos abiertos nos permiten ver cómo va evolucionando. ¿Y cómo va evolucionando la pandemia? Mal para México. No hay forma de decir otra cosa. Por mucho que la posición pública sea vamos mejor, vamos dándole la vuelta a la curva. Nada más hay que recordar que el doctor López-Gatell dijo que si llegábamos a 60,000 defunciones iba a ser una catástrofe. Son palabras de él. Vamos en casi 300,000 defunciones, 100,000 registradas, y la misma Secretaría de Salud dice otras 200,000 de exceso de mortalidad que no llegaron al diagnóstico, pero probablemente son COVID. Tener ese nivel de defunciones ha sido un desastre, es una catástrofe, usando palabras de López-Gatell, para el país. Por supuesto que hemos respondido como sistema de salud ampliando las camas hospitalarias, lo primero que hemos hecho, convirtiendo hospitales y dejando, entonces, voy a decir olvidadas, pero esperando otras patologías porque estamos tratando COVID. Pero ¿qué pasa? Cuando vamos a evaluar, y nos lo evalúan todo el tiempo, lo podemos ver en la prensa, ¿cómo nos va a nuestros hospitales? Nos va muy mal, no nos va igual de bien. Y cuando lo vemos cómo les va a los hospitales privados, que también suben datos a la plataforma, contra hospitales públicos, vemos una distancia muy grande en un indicador muy clave, que es letalidad. México en este momento es el país con mayor letalidad. Eso quiere decir cuántos se mueren de los que se enferman. Entonces, México, la curva nunca tuvo esta bajada, nunca la controlamos como países como Tailandia, Islandia, Nueva Zelanda. No fuimos esos. No fuimos como Estados Unidos, que bajó y volvió a subir. México prácticamente no bajó. Ya entramos a una segunda ola con diciembre. No fuimos a Europa, que bajó mucho en verano, bajaron todas sus restricciones de circulación, se fueron ingleses y belgas a la playa en España y se llevaron el virus. Está medido, la infección de verano los está afectando ahora en diciembre. Entonces, en salud sí hay muchos indicadores muy fuertes, son internacionales, se comparan. Somos el país que está en quinto lugar en casos reportados, cuarto en defunciones, 17 en pruebas, de los 25 países más grandes y más poblados. O sea, estamos en el fondo. Se ha discutido mucho que no hemos tenido pruebas. Se puede entender porque tener acceso a las pruebas era complicado. Y el primer lugar en letalidad en este momento. Letalidad está realmente muy mal. Estamos en una letalidad promedio del 10%, pero hay hospitales del IMSS que llegan a veces hasta el 30%, y hospitales de altísimo nivel, como nuestros institutos nacionales, con mortalidades abajo del 10%. Esta es la variación que tenemos en el país. Y ya Luis Carlos habló de que Bloomberg, por ejemplo, también nos pone en esta escala donde mide no solamente cómo nos va en salud, sino cómo nos va en otros, y hace una combinación de indicadores, un índice compuesto, y estamos en el lugar 53, el último de 53. Arriba de nosotros está Argentina y Perú, pero países que pensamos, vistos de acá, que su respuesta a la epidemia ha sido peor, como Brasil, está bastante puestos arriba de nosotros, está en lugar 37. Entonces, sí, nuestra situación venía complicada, y ahora con COVID se nos complica más. La vacuna es una buena noticia, la firmamos. De todas maneras, el problema va a ser vacunar. Vacunar es lo más grande que ha tenido, es la campaña más grande de vacunación que vamos a tener en la humanidad. México tiene un buen sistema de vacunación, tenemos que ser optimistas en eso. Tenemos coberturas altas de vacunas. Cada año vacunamos. Nosotros, a diferencia de otros países, salimos a vacunar a la calle, vamos a la casa de las personas, no esperamos que vengan. Entonces creo que si las vacunas llegan, vamos a poder empezar a vacunar, y probablemente después del segundo semestre del próximo año empecemos a ver esto que ahora ya se hizo popular, la inmunidad de rebaño. Prefiero hablar de inmunidad de grupo, alcanzando niveles de protección que nos permitan regresar a cierta normalidad que siempre va a seguir siendo por un buen tiempo, con cubrebocas y con distancia. Y por último, ya que hablamos de cubrebocas, creo que López Obrador hace este modelo de salir en público sin cubrebocas y hablando de no lo uso. Se contradice con la misma foto que vimos ayer del doctor Alcocer firmando dentro de su despacho lo de la compra de las primeras 34 millones de vacunas a una compañía, y el doctor Alcocer adentro de su despacho, el secretario de salud, está usando cubrebocas. Entonces, esta diferencia de discursos creo que es realmente, genera problemas en opinión pública. Las medidas de uso de cubrebocas afuera andan en 70%, se distribuyen por marginación y pobreza, mientras más marginados, menos cubrebocas. Y eso es lo que nos va a proteger de aquí por lo menos hasta julio, porque no vamos a alcanzar a vacunar a todos.
Thank you, Carlos. A wonderful explanation. So we have talked about poverty, social programs, security, governance, and there's a lot of questions. Thank you for your questions. Claudia Calvin, a wonderful friend of us, she's asking us about women. What about women? What about women's rights? What about violence against women? How is this AMLO government performing regarding women? Does any one of you would like to answer that question? Make a comment? Maribeth?
Sure. So not very well, really, surprisingly, for someone who, whose political career was built in the left. So femicides are up, of course, and other kinds of crime like domestic violence seem to be up, probably related to the confinement of the pandemic. I think what's most surprising, though, is this extraordinary movement of women who have become very vocal and very organized with demonstrations, with the big national strike we had back in March. López Obrador has not known how to respond. He's been very sort of suspicious and sees the hand of his political opponents. And he's sort of lost what would seem to be a very natural opportunity to embrace, a cause that reflects human rights and one assumes, values that he believes in. But he seems to just have had a bit of a tin ear and responded sort of with some coolness. I think he's just lost a chance to really embrace what is a very important moment, highlighting what is a real problem in terms of violence against women.
Thank you, Maribeth. You have any take on that, Gonzalo?
Yeah, I mean, I really coincide with Beth. I believe that if López Obrador doesn't have an issue in his agenda for the past 12 or 18 years, then you don't have it. Even if it's important, even if it's women, even if it's COVID, even if it's Biden. I mean, if he doesn't have it in his radar, then that doesn't count. And women is part of this issue. I mean, he has an idea. I mean, the good thing is that, I mean, he has strong ideas for a long time. Sometimes I change my ideas from Monday to Tuesday. So, but he has the same, which is on one side right, but because we live in a changing world, because every day the world changes. I think one of the most important elements of a politician, of a president, of a prime minister, is to spot what is going on in what is changing in the world. And I just go back to COVID. You know, he just doesn't realize that COVID is there. COVID is there. He doesn't realize that the demonstration for women in March was there. So yeah, that's my thought.
Creo que me congelé. ¿Me pueden oír? Could you listen to me?
Podemos oír, pero te congelaste. Exacto.
Okay, but it's perfectly fine. I had today we're having all sorts of technical problems, but I'm glad that everybody can see you. And Luis Carlos, what about this coming midterm election? I mean, how you see the election coming? I mean, I believe it won't be that difficult for Morena to retain majorities in Congress, but you let us know. I mean, what is your take about this? Let's talk a little bit about the future.
Yes, of course. At Integralia, we are following the elections very closely, and we estimate that Morena will continue to be the party with the most number of votes. However, much less than in 2018. 2018 was a tsunami, an electoral tsunami, and it is very difficult that to be repeated. So we estimate that probably Morena will continue to be the biggest party in the Chamber of Deputies, but probably not with a constitutional majority as it does have, because of two reasons. One is that Morena will perform less well than in 2018, because there is dissatisfaction, because even though this 60% of the population, 50% will continue to support López Obrador, in 2018 there were huge numbers from the middle class, from the northern part of Mexico that voted for López Obrador, and that segment is disenchanted. So they will leave López Obrador segment, and they will vote for the opposition. And second, because in 2018, there was some sort of electoral engineering to bypass the Mexican law on the part of Morena, to inflate their numbers and to surpass the ceiling that the Mexican constitution allows to Mexican parties in the concept of overrepresentation, which means that Morena got 43% of the Mexican vote in 2018. However, Morena and its allies have today about 62% of the seats in the lower chamber of deputies. And how was that possible? I will not get into details, but this week, the Mexican Electoral Institute just approved some guidelines to stop that from happening again. That is very positive. So that is my perspective. Morena will continue to be the biggest party in the Mexican Congress, but less much so than in 2018. The second question is regarding state elections for governors and for local congresses. Today, Morena has about, is the first party in about 20 state assemblies out of 32. Probably Morena will come down to about 12, 15, we don't know, but less much than 20, which it holds today. And regarding gubernatorial elections, 15 of them will take place in 2021. Half of the country will change governors. Today, it looks like Morena is the favorite in about 10 or 12 of them, but we don't still have candidates. If the opposition manages to successfully build coalitions, as it happens to be occurring today, then in a very good scenario for the opposition, they could win probably half of the gubernatorial races, and the other half would be won by Morena. That is more or less how we see elections next year. And final comment, Rafael. Of course, the second half of the sexennium will be very different if a frustrated president, as López Obrador will be, is contained by the Mexican Chamber of Deputies that, in comparison to López Obrador, frustrated, but without any check on his power. That is completely different story.
Thank you, Luis Carlos. Carlos Magis, you gave us a very complex scenario in terms of COVID-19. If you were advising President López Obrador, what will be the 2-3 things you will do to stop that very high mortality rate and that very high contagious rate? I mean, is there a way, besides the vaccine that is coming, I mean, what would you do? We know it's about social distancing, but give us a sense of how an epidemiologist will do and will be your advice to López Obrador.
Yes, we need to put an emphasis on masks, distance. Also, we need lockdowns. The lockdowns in May worked, and nowadays we don't have nothing like that. It's only recommendations to stay at home. We also need a recommendation that in Mexico hasn't been a lot in the media, is to ventilate inside your house, your office. Ventilation, open the windows. Has been said that in Mexico City. I was watching the Vespertina, always at 7 o'clock in the afternoon, there is a conference, and the person in charge of the mobility in Mexico City said, although it's going to be winter, open the windows of your buses, cars, and all that. So we need that. But I don't think we are able to manage the problem with the way things are doing in hospitals. That's because it was easy to buy respirators and all that, but it's not easy to have the people trained to manage them. Training and specialists takes a lot. And we are at the end of our effort. Also, physicians, nurses, they are tired. They have been working all this year. They are not going to be replaced. There is no one coming to help us. We have like 2 months, some people, physicians that came from Cuba to work in Mexico City. That was a huge problem, a political problem. They're returning to Cuba. So we are not going to put a lot. There are no way of controlling. Well, we have learned more about how to control COVID in hospitals, but not a lot more. So we are waiting for the vaccine. That's our holy grail. Without vaccine, we are not going to improve a lot.
Well, it's a little bit like in the United States. It's really about the vaccine, because lockdowns and social distancing hasn't been that effective in this country. Maribel, Sheridan, what about Biden? I mean, there's a new horizon coming with Joe Biden. He's someone who has traveled throughout Mexico, throughout Latin America. I don't think he will have a learning curve regarding Mexico. How you see the U.S. Mexican relations evolving in the next 4 years, Maribel?
I think it's a hugely interesting question, and obviously the president is not off to a great start with Biden, being that, first of all, he doesn't even recognize him, and second of all, when he went to Washington a few months ago, he didn't see anybody from the Democratic Party. So there's a bit of a chill. And what's extraordinary to me is that I think the president really thought that Trump would win. I think he saw Trump is like himself, a man leading a movement, a man who defies expectations. There's just such a funny bonding between the two of them. And of course, you know, that was not the right call. Trump lost. But having said that, I think that while Biden has a different agenda, certainly Biden will be far different on migration, far more interested in providing more of the traditional rights of asylum and so on. I think, and he will be more interested in questions like human rights, of course, than Trump. But, you know, Biden's going to need Mexico. We're going to probably have a giant wave of migration from Central America because those countries have just suffered two horrible hurricanes, terrible. They've had the disaster of COVID. They still have problems of course, violence and poverty. And I think that many migrants, between all the disasters they're experiencing in their terms of economy, in terms of their homes being ruined by the hurricanes, they will perceive a real change of policy if Biden says no more forcing migrants to wait in Mexico while they apply for asylum. If there's more of an asylum system reopened again, I mean, migrants are rational people, and I think there's every chance there's going to be quite a significant flow. So Biden will want Mexico to help restrain that, and therefore I think that, you know, Biden will get over the fact that AMLO took forever to recognize him. He's got bigger problems, right? So I think ultimately the relationship will change in some ways. It'll be interesting to see how much AMLO develops a relationship with Biden, who arguably has more similar opinions than he does in terms of policy. But I think the relationship will have to function because of the mutual interests.
Yes, I believe that Biden is a pragmatic politician and someone who gets very well the importance of Mexico for the U.S. I was just reading some of his speeches when he came to Mexico, one actually in February 2016, and he was, I would say, very right on target. He understands the affinities of the two countries, and it's, yeah, I believe he won't have any learning curve. Gonzalo, Luis Carlos, would you like to comment something on these U.S.-Mexican relations, or you, Gonzalo? Because I have a question for you, Gonzalo. I believe that, I mean, is there any Latin American government doing well in terms of fighting poverty? Is there any, seems to me that in the last few years, all of those programs in the, from the late 1990s, early this century, we were like very, very ambitious war on poverty programs are not there anymore. And just give us a sense, what would you do if you were advising AMLO to reduce poverty in Mexico, to have, I mean, what he's trying to achieve, which is a more justice society. But Luis Carlos, you have any comment on U.S.-Mexican relations?
Just one additional comment that I think one possibility is that you will see AMLO very nationalistic in the coming 2 to 3 years. If we saw an AMLO submissive to Mr. Trump, probably we'll see an AMLO very nationalistic, very anti-gringo, embracing the national flag like Lázaro Cárdenas, when the administration of the new administration in Washington or international companies that have invested in the Mexican energy sector began using the treaty, the trade treaty, to try to defend their interest in Mexico. That may happen soon.
Okay, Luis Carlos, that's an interesting vision. I believe, and I'm telling my friends in Washington, I mean, to be very practical with Mexico, because it seems to me that one of the key things for Biden is democracy and human rights. And I will say they will have to take it easy with AMLO and with having a militarized country. And so I hope they could get some lessons from the past and not really press Mexico into that, because to me that will create a lot of frictions, but we'll see. So Gonzalo, is there any country doing good things in Latin America, and what is what AMLO and his team will have to do to improve things regarding social justice?
Well, I mean, it is true, Rafa, that the pandemic really hit us, all countries really, really hard. However, the difference between countries is how governments reacted. In Latin America, poverty increased a lot. In Peru, the problem with employment was even more problematic than in Mexico. Colombia suffering from the pandemic, Argentina suffering. However, I think the main difference between what we did and what they are doing, or what they did, is that they put a lot of effort in trying to protect those without employment, both formally and informally, and we didn't do that. So from the government point of view, is, well, this is going to pass. We don't want to support workers through firms, because AMLO had this idea of the FOBAPROA years ago, that we were supporting rich people, and so those ideas are still there, and that together with austerity, the austeridad that Luis Carlos already mentioned, that if you put them together, then you don't have any programs. We said it at the beginning. We don't have any programs to support the problems that we have. We do have social programs, Rafa, that were designed a couple of years ago to support the elderly, to support people with disabilities. So it is important to have this type of support. Of course, every social policy would need this type of support. However, it is not enough, because as we said before, those programs were not designed for the problem we have today. So it is not true that those programs, even they are called for poverty, for the poor, it doesn't mean that they're going to solve the problem that we have. Let me share a second, if you allow me, the screen, just to show you one couple of graphs. Can you see this?
Yes.
Yes.
So this is poverty. This is what we call labor poverty, people without enough labor income to buy a minimum consumption basket of food. So as you see what happened in 2008, it increased a lot of poverty, then it stabilized, and then it was down for some time between 2015 and even in the first quarter of 2020. This point here, a very low point, is still 2020, the first quarter. And the most important element to that happened, the reduction of poverty, from my point of view, is increasing in minimum wage. However, those efforts just disappear because in 1 or 2 months, labor poverty increased to 52%, and now we are recovering to 44.5%. But still, it's a huge problem. Of course, Rafa, you said before, what this is due to pandemic and what this is due to the government. Well, of course, the most important hit, the most important cause was the pandemic. However, let me just stress and underline that without any support for the unemployment, without any support sometimes for firms, even small firms, even tiny firms, those firms they needed support, and we were not giving them support. And I think that the main difference between what we did and what other countries in Latin America did. So what is happening, Rafa and colleagues, is before AMLO and before the pandemic, Mexico was a poor country with low employment and unequal society. With the pandemic today, we have a reduction even more in terms of GDP. We have a reduction of around 10%. We are a more unequal society, and poverty is growing. So it is not, I mean, we really need to do something to support the economy, to boost the economy. Otherwise, the recovery will be very, very low. So, and the minimum wage will not be enough.
Thank you, Gonzalo. This is very good. Let me, there's a question by Claudia Basurto. I mean, what is AMLO's take on human rights? I wonder if you could have a reaction to this. Does he care about human rights? Is this part of his agenda? And then I will ask you, I mean, to have a last comment. We should be closing soon. And let me ask you the following question. Let's imagine that we're already in 2024, I mean, at the end of the AMLO's administration. So could you give me a sense, I mean, what is going to happen, Luis Carlos, politically speaking, in the election in 2024? Gonzalo, how you see poverty rates in 2024? Carlos Magis, how would you see healthcare issues? What will be the final toll of this COVID-19? But first of all, I wonder if you could have some reaction about human rights provision in Mexico, and then why don't you give me a sense of how you see things at the end of the AMLO's administration? Maribeth, any reaction on human rights?
Yes, actually, I just published a story yesterday about the whole effort to find the disappeared, and this is an area in which there actually has been some real progress on the part of the Mexican government. What's interesting is at the start of the AMLO sexenio, you saw a president talking about a very different approach to human rights. He wanted to solve the Ayotzinapa case with the 43 students who were disappeared back in 2014. You saw him create gender parity in his cabinet. He talked about migrants' rights. He was a very traditional supporter of that. He talked about the effort to find the disappeared and said there would be no budget limit. So you saw a lot of really positive signs. Now, the picture is quite a bit more mixed at this point. I would say that certainly the Commission to Search for the Disappeared has made some real progress. However, fundamentally, the Fiscalia, the judicial authorities and the police have been unable to stop more disappearances from happening. So in fact, the numbers continue to climb. They've done a very good job about setting up committees, trying to finance the search for bodies, but the overall problem is simply so huge. I think there probably will be progress on Ayotzinapa. I think the president is very, very determined to solve that case. But I think that, arguably there's been no real progress on migrants' rights because he came under pressure from Trump. And it's been a question of rounding up people. And, there's a bigger refugee program in Mexico, but I think it's hard to say that migrants enjoy more rights. I don't think he's been very attentive to women's issues, as we've talked about. And I think that overall, when you look at issues like torture or certainly human rights issues in the military, those don't seem to be getting resolved any more quickly. So I think that there's certain high profile issues that he's committed to and made some important decisions on, but many others where there's really not been much of a change.
Thank you, Maribel. Carlos, this is 2024, how Mexican health is doing?
Yes, well, for instance, we are not going to have any COVID pandemic for that date, but we are going to have a huge problem with health services. This process has developed this independence of some states are not really being affiliated to INSABI. The states that they are in the hands of governors of the PAN or other governors. So we are going to have a very fragmented health service from the Ministry of Health part. Social Security is going to be the same. ISSSTE for the bureaucracy is going to be the same. And if we don't reach good numbers in other diseases, that it's very difficult, there is going to be a disappointment.
Thank you, Carlos. Luis Carlos, what will be your take in terms of politics? Your mic.
Yes, let me describe some scenarios, some nightmares. We will have a very frustrated president, and then he will become very polarizing, even more than today. We will miss López Obrador of his first 2 years because it is likely that he will become more polarizing. Populist presidents become polarizing when things don't get the way they thought they would be. Second, a very important element is how the economy reacts to that, if we will continue to have stability, or if the fiscal imbalance that will emerge at some point during the second half of the sexennial makes economic instability happen. We don't know yet. How López Obrador will react in terms of spending to that frustration, it's something to be seen. The second thing is how Morena is going to decide the succession, because there are two possibilities. One is that Morena or López Obrador chooses a moderate as the candidate to the presidency. The other is that a radical wins the nomination. Two different scenarios. And if there is a radical who wins the nomination, then the moderates may run in a different party. There are three new parties that won registration last month. So there are other vehicles for the moderates to run in 2024. Don't forget that. And the second is that, in my opinion, the populism of López Obrador will create another populism on the right. And therefore, it is likely that instead of having 3 or 4 candidates to the presidency, we'll have 2 main formations, Morenas or López Obrador candidate, and one on the right, a populist on the right. And that will polarize even more Mexico. That is a shame, that is very sad, but this type of experiments create that type of reaction, and probably there will be 2 very polarizing figures running in 2024. My perspective is that as I see things today, it is likely that Morena's candidate will win in 2024. If that is a moderate person, then you may see that in the next sexennial, that person could contain, reveal some of the damages that López Obrador may have done to certain elements of Mexican economy or society. And that may take Mexico then again to a balance in a few years now.
Thank you. Thank you, Luis Carlos. This is very, very thoughtful and very worrisome. Gonzalo.
Yeah, so I mean, we already heard very important ideas from my colleagues. The frustration not only for López Obrador, but also from the people will be important by 2024. I believe that the economy will not recover as fast as López Obrador is thinking. He's thinking that perhaps in March they will recover the whole employment. We have to see if that is true, or even if the numbers are equal to what we had before. I believe that the quality of the employment and productivity will be not as strong as we think. I believe that poverty reduction will be slow because of that. I believe that if we don't boost the private investment, then the recovery will be even lower, and therefore more frustration in terms of employment and more frustration in terms of the president. Luis Carlos already talked about the politics. I really hope that his idea of a moderates in the near future will be the one, because the polarization that we have, not only today, but over the past years, in part due to López Obrador, in part due to the mistakes of the other parties, I think is increasing, and it increases as well in the States. So hopefully, I mean, the optimistic view here is that both Biden now and in the future, the candidate who wins in 2004 and 2024 will be moderate ones who will put the country and the countries together. And just finally, Rafa, the other element will be by 2024, what would happen to these charts? No? You mentioned that before. This is López Obrador popularity at the moment. It is high, but Calderón was higher. And all presidents, except for Cedillo, their popularity has been down when the sexennial arrived. So it will depend. So we here in 2024, we'll see what happens to these reds graph in terms of what is happening to López Obrador. So let's just put that on perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gonzalo. You have the last word, Maribeth.
I think it's going to be, it's hard to improve on what my colleagues have said, quite honestly, but I think that unfortunately, certainly with, I would say there's not a particularly, optimistic scenario at this point. I don't really see how security will improve dramatically. Certainly the economy is at best going to be sort of climbing back slowly. And it is, I think the whole question of political polarization is yet to see, as Luis Carlos pointed out, will depend quite a bit on how the forces of power change in the elections this coming year, and what kind of candidates will be running for the president.
Well, thank you very much. I believe you gave us a wonderful responses. This is each one of you were very thoughtful, and thank you very much. We'll prepare a takeaway. I will ask my team to send a summary of what you had said, because I believe that this is you were very thoughtful, and of course you're very knowledgeable about the situation in Mexico. And so I appreciate your participation. Sorry for the technical problems. I hate not to be there on camera, but thank you, Gonzalo, Hernández, Licona.
Gracias, Rafa.
Carlos Magis. Gracias, Carlos Ugalde. Gracias, Maribeth, Sheridan.
Thank you.
This will open soon, a few months from now, and please come to San Diego. I hope you all are invited to do AMLO at 3. I hope we can do it here, but otherwise we will do it, because I truly appreciate your savvy and your very thoughtful comments. Hasta luego, and we'll have a happy holidays, and cuídense mucho todos. Gracias.
Gracias.
Seguimos
Gracias
el
a
próximo año
los
con la
invitados.
programación del centro. Hasta luego.